We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth, India. This session is presented by the Australian High Commission. It's our pleasure to present Devotion, the Journey of Faith, Hannah Kent in conversation with Anisha Lalvani. Writer Hannah Kent's recent novel, Devotion, is a stirring story of girlhood and friendship, faith and suspicion, and the impossible lengths we go to for the ones we love. An impassioned tribute to both love and the land, the narrative follows a family's escape from religious persecution to South Australia and the consequential bond that is formed between two young girls. In conversation with Anisha Lalvani, Kent discusses the roots and inspiration behind her latest work and its melodic celebration of place and persistence. Writer Hannah Kent's recent novel, Devotion, is a stirring story of girlhood and friendship, faith and suspicion, and the impossible lengths we go to for the ones we love. An impassioned tribute to both love and the land, the narrative follows a family's escape from religious persecution to South Australia and the consequential bond that is formed between two young girls. In conversation with Anisha Lalvani, Kent discusses the roots and inspiration behind her latest work and its melodic celebration of place and persistence. Hannah Kent is the co-founder and deputy editor of the Australian literary journal Kill Your Darlings and is completing her PhD at Flinders University. In 2011, Kent won the inaugural Writing Australia Unpublished Manuscript Award. Burial Rites is her first novel. Anisha Lalvani is a research consultant at Sattva, a social impact consulting firm. She's worked in the development sector at Tata Institute of Social Sciences and has editorial and marketing experience working with Yoda Press and the Jaipur Literature Festival. She's also worked on communications and programming at the Rang Shankara Theatre in Bengaluru and is currently working on a novel exploring the complexities of living in modern India. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing it in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at Jaipur Lit Fest. Ladies and gentlemen, Devotion, the Journey of Faith, Hannah Kent in conversation with Anisha Lalvani.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anisha, and I'm delighted to speak with Hannah Kent today. She's an author from Australia, and she's best known for her bestsellers, both historical fiction, The Good People and Burial Rites, which the latter, which I hear is in talks to be made into a film with Jennifer Lawrence. Today, however, we'll be discussing her new novel, Devotion. And as I read it, actually, the imagery was so strong and captivating, it almost felt like watching a film in some ways. It's an extremely poetic, lyrical, very beguiling and visceral novel that it captures the intense passion of two girls thrust into deep connection and love in a time and place that simply did not allow it. It's set against the backdrop of the migration of the old Lutheran sect or community from Prussia to Australia. Despite these two strong themes that run through the book, the overcurrent of the lead character, Hannah, and her friend, lover, Thea's connection with nature in all its glory and contrast across the continents, however, is so strong. To me, at least, it felt like the novel was almost a song of devotion to nature itself. And there are so many forms of devotion that I read in your book, Hannah. The devotion that the girls have to each other, of course, the devotion to family, community, religion, and of course, the questioning of those forms of devotion, right? And of course, the devotion of nature that I spoke about earlier. So the first question I wanted to ask you is because I myself, I'm not too familiar with, the history of the old Lutheran and the community there, and I'm not sure how much of our audience would be familiar with it. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, what this community was, why they faced discrimination, persecution, and why they felt the need to leave Prussia and, migrate to America, Australia, wherever it is that they migrated to.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, of course, as well for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak at the online portion of this wonderful festival. To answer your question, Anisha, I actually didn't know a great deal about the migration of old Lutherans and the reasons for that migration until I started researching for this book. What I did know growing up in South Australia on Paramount country, where I still actually live today, is that I was very aware that there were many elements of German and Prussian culture which still survived. I live in a place which, for instance, is very well known for its wine, and the viticulture here is heavily influenced by many Germans and Prussians who came out in the 19th century. We also have many words in South Australia which are borrowed from German. Instead of saying milk bar, we will say, the deli for delicatessen. And even the food we eat, sometimes if you go to the central market in Adelaide, my city, you will get the German sausages and the sauerkraut, and it seems to be much more sort of widely accepted. We also have in places such as the Barossa, which is one of the most famous sort of wine regions we have in South Australia, still many German institutions. For instance, the music, there's still the brass band, there are choirs, and this very strong presence of the Lutheran Church. So I was aware growing up of all of these things. But it wasn't until I actually moved to the eastern side of Australia, I lived in Melbourne for about 7 years, that I realized that many other Australians were unaware of this influx of German immigrants in the 19th century. I think many Australians are very, across the colonization of Australia by the British. We have a lot of those British narratives, but not so much the German. And I remember thinking, I wonder whether that might be an interesting place to begin a novel or to begin thinking about the sorts of things to write about. And then when I started researching the reasons for these sort of patterns of emigration, and certainly the first sort of lot of about 600 emigrants, I thought, yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. What had basically happened was that the Prussian king, King Frederick William III, had decided that he wanted to unify the Protestant churches in Prussia at that time. And this was done initially as a sort of look, I'm creating a union church. You can join if you want to. You don't have to. We're making little changes. Eventually, there was a union service book that was published, which did make liturgical changes. So, for instance, the taking of in the Christian tradition, the taking of wine and bread. The ceremony was altered slightly. And as time went on, there were people who increasingly disagreed with the changes to these rituals and the changes to text within the rituals and their services. And at first they were permitted to disagree, but as the king increasingly decided that, no, my union church is the only church for Prussia, these congregations became known as Old Lutherans because they wouldn't deviate from their old ways of faith. And they became persecuted, initially by fines, and then ultimately people were jailed. They had their belongings confiscated. Pastors caught, using the old services would be imprisoned. And so many of them had to flee. Churches were locked, and people and communities who wished to continue practicing in their old ways of worship were forced to do so in secret and at great risk, at great personal risk, because many of these people were not people of means. This was a laboring class. And so they really could not afford to pay fines and to have their belongings taken from them. And this was ultimately what led to emigration. There was a particular Pastor Carvel, who has many statues here now in South Australia, but he was someone who spent a great deal of time and resources trying to find the means to support a mass emigration. Initially, they thought they might go to Russia, and then he happened to go be in London, and he met a man who happened to be the chairperson of the then South Australian company. And I think he was attracted by the idea of essentially bringing over a labouring class to work the land which had been seized by the British from the original inhabitants of Australia. But many of these people were land speculators and they had no one to work it. So it wasn't altogether altruistic, but essentially he then financed this initial stage of immigration. And then you suddenly had about 4 or 5 ships of 200 Lutherans apiece making a 6-month journey over to the new colony.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense because I can understand the sort of the factual, the base for it in the novel. I think even the character of the pastor, etc., you model it on somebody real, right? So that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit about the love story, right? Which is the big theme of the book, the center, the heart of the novel. So of course, it's, the narrative is focused on the love story between Hannah and Thea. And, it's interesting because you sort of position both of them as outsiders in a very tight-knit community, although for different reasons and in different ways, right? And it's very interesting. There's a lovely quote that captures Hannah's feelings, about her peers, where she says, "I yearn for Christiana, who's her peer. She yearned for approval, and yet she hated to be in her company." And she said, "She makes me feel, I don't know, as though I'm nothing." So I wanted to understand whether you felt that it was important to position both Hannah and Thea as outsiders in order to build their love story, which is essentially a queer love story.
I think that's true. I think that's a very accurate reading of it. I knew as I was sort of researching the backdrop, if you will, of this Lutheran immigration, my interest and my understanding of what the heart would be novel was this love story. And I think I was already very interested in the power of love and the way it can transform lives and the way it can suddenly imbue a life with such meaning as to make it almost, to make it religious in feeling, to make it sublime. And to do that, I immediately sort of understood that for that significance to be achieved in this love between these two girls, that they needed to have not received that sort of love or experienced that sort of love previously. I think they are loved by their families in very different ways. Each girl has a different relationship to her parents and in Hannah's case, her sibling, but neither of them are completely accepted. And I think this is what I was wanting to explore in their relationship, is that these two girls have grown up both outsiders, and because they are judged in several ways because of their behavior. Hannah has this sort of synesthesia, whereas when she is in nature, it sings to her. She has this very strong pull to the outside world, which sets her apart. Thea is the daughter of a Vend, a Sorbic or a Slav minority who are suspected of in being engaged in witchcraft and herbalism, so she's judged for that. But together, they have total acceptance and total recognition of one another. And I think it was, I was interested in exploring that idea of you might be different, you might be considered a little strange by the people who have raised you, who they might want you to change slightly, and then suddenly you meet someone who completely sees who you are in all its complexity and contradictory, in all your flaws and in all your virtues, completely accepts you as that. And so you have no need to change. You don't need to fit any kind of mold to be loved. And so I really thought this is initially the gift of that these girls give each other in friendship, and then the bond that is formed as a course of that friendship, and perhaps as a part of their difference as well, means that these girls eventually fall in love with one another.
Right.
And so I think also I'm just interested in outsiders as a novelist. Hannah is a girl who feels that she has to try very hard to fit in and to perform the societal role which has been set aside for her by her congregation. And in writing her, I think I also leaned quite hard on some of my own experiences and feelings as an adolescent or as a young teenager, whereas I felt quite different and apart from my peers, and that it was a struggle to try and learn the ways that would make me accepted in my peer group. And then when I did finally meet people who completely got me, that was a very powerful, very wonderful feeling, a transformational feeling at that age. So these were the sorts of things I was interested in exploring by making them different, but by then allowing them to embrace those differences within their relationship.
Right. Yeah. And it almost feels like Thea is, at least, when I read it, it almost seemed to me like Thea is kind of like a breath of fresh air to Hannah, who, she's experiencing all these restrictions that society is thrusting down upon her, right? That all young women go through. A sense of disgust and derision, at the fact of menstruation, or her not being able to sleep next to her twin brother, the fact that she's growing up now. So it just seems to me like Thea sort of opens up her world and makes her feel like, it's okay to grow up into womanhood. And that was, I love the way you did that. That was beautiful as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a very good observation.
Another interesting thing is sort of Hannah's relationship with her mother, sort of juxtaposed with Thea's relationship with her mother, right? Whereas Thea's family is a lot more informal, and Hannah feels a lot freer in Thea's family. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to these two mother-daughter relationships.
I was interested in exploring the idea of motherhood and parenthood to a lesser extent in this book, because like you said, it's another form of devotion, you know, and I think it can come in so many ways. I mean, devotion might lie at the heart of it, but the nature of the relationship can shift and change. And in Hannah's case, I was interested in exploring, I guess initially I was concentrating on her own sense of being different. And I thought what would make that feel particularly acute, especially for a young woman, was if your own mother was a woman who perfectly embodied all the ideal woman held up by your community. So Hannah's father is a church elder, and his wife, Hannah's mother, is someone who is, you know, can tick all the boxes for the expected virtues. She's hardworking, she's modest, she's beautiful, but doesn't, you know, draw attention to the fact. She is popular amongst the other wives of the community. She's pious, she's incredibly religious, she's very deferential to her husband. She does things without question. And she's held up as this sort of ideal woman. And Hannah immediately knows that she's not like that, especially as she's grown older, and she looks very different from her mother. She's the only person in the family who has sort of the characteristics not shared. Everyone else is sort of has dark eyes, dark hair, and she describes herself as a, you know, as a cuckoo, basically. And I was interested in sort of setting up the mother as this person who is perhaps initially seen as critical of her daughter because she doesn't conform, because these things, this being of this, the ways in which she is a woman is not essentially what is held up as the same ideal that she finds quite easy to be. But over the course of the book, I was interested in Hannah discovering that her mother does indeed love her very deeply, and in fact has suppressed and sacrificed a great deal in order to be that perfect woman, to be that idealized Christian wife. And I was interested in, I guess, unfolding Hannah's understanding of her own mother and coming to perhaps a belated appreciation of the depth of her love, and also the grief that her mother has experienced that perhaps has changed her and made her a little bit more withholding, a little bit more critical. At the same time, it felt very natural then when I was thinking about Thea's family, and the way in which they are so attractive to Hannah, to make her equally as devoted to her daughter. Her name is Anna Maria, but she is absolutely a different kind of person. She is someone who is, I think, very sensual. She is an old Lutheran, but she also practices herbalism. She's a midwife. She's very familiar with the body. She's very accepting of the body and all its sort of attributes. You know, there's a scene in the book where Hannah is caught sort of licking her bowl when she's eating there, and she is completely embarrassed because she realizes it's not really polite behavior. And Thea's family and her mother, you know, sort of say there's no shame in appetite. You're allowed to be as you are. And so, of course, as a young woman, that is an incredibly powerful thing. And I think it probably heightens her attraction to Thea, because Thea is also emblematic of that kind of much more sensual, freeing, accepting way of life. But I think, yeah, by the end of the book, I would hope that these two iterations of what it is to be a mother are actually not that dissimilar, that both of these mothers have an incredible love for their daughters, and yeah, except the circumstances of their life have meant that they have showed it in completely different ways.
Right. No, that's very interesting, because that's sort of, you know, it renders motherhood in this very ambiguous way. Whereas I think when you're younger, you tend to see things in terms of very black and white. So it's just sort of natural that as Hannah grows up and, you know, she goes through whatever experiences she does, she begins to understand sort of the undercurrent of love that her mother had for her, which is, you know, displayed in the form of these restrictions and protection and security, etc.
I think protection is a good word for it. She wants to protect her daughter, but in order, the only way that she thinks she can do that is by trying to to steer her in this very narrow way of being and becoming a woman. She wants her to be married. But that's because she wants her to be secure. But as a young girl, Hannah doesn't see it like that. She thinks, oh, you know, my mother wants me to be like her, but I'm not, and she won't accept me as I am. But then, yeah, as you say, she gets older and she realizes that so much of her mother's behavior towards her was governed equally by love and fear. You know, Hannah's mother has already lost several children by the time, you know, they set out for South Australia. And she never really, I guess, expresses the grief that she experiences as a result of that loss. But it's something which is found out later by Hannah, that she thinks, oh, okay, yeah, maybe that did really impact my mother. And she also did me the service of not showing that grief. She didn't want to affect the family life, but this is the toll that is taken.
Right. I think that a lot of women probably take, right, quietly in some ways. Another interesting thing is, you know, how central the theme of religion is to the book. Of course, the community are old Lutherans, so, you know, that has to be. But when I read it, at least it seemed to me that it was a restricting force, right? And religion was a restricting force for Hannah. And in the latter half of the book, you know, she kind of sees through it. But it's interesting because, again, it's not so black and white. I was listening to an interview, a podcast of yours, and you were talking about how when you were young, you took to religion and the church yourself. It was not something that was imposed on from your family. And, you know, you learned a lot about love and, you know, so many lessons about love, etc., through religion. So I was wondering if you can speak to your own feelings about religion and the church and how you wanted to position religion in this book.
It's a good question. I'm very interested in faith, and I'm very interested in religion, because I think it can often be painted in a particular light. And I think people's perception of religion is very much colored by their private experiences and prejudices and things like that. You know, for instance, you know, as we know, the church is responsible for a great deal of trauma and evil in the world. And yet it is also responsible for incredible acts of goodness, and has increased the well-being of many, many, many people. And so I like the way, I'm interested is a better word. I'm interested in the way it is multifaceted. I was absolutely drawn to religion as a teenager. And I think that was very much part of my search for greater meaning. And I found a great deal of meaning in my relationship to the church, all of which was to do with love and acceptance. And like you said, I did learn a great deal about the nature of love in going to church. I don't attend church anymore, but I think that's actually that's more of a political decision because of various other you know, it can be a complicated situation, but I think because of other worldviews, which I don't actually see as intrinsic to a religious message of love, but is instead more the workings of, you know, of people and certain ideologies, and about controlling other people and about othering other people. But I remain interested in it, both as an institution, but also as faith, as an act of surrender. And I think ultimately that's what I came back to in this book. I wanted to explore surrender as an act of love and as an act of seeking. And I think it comes up in various forms in this book, this idea that people find meaning in a higher power than themselves and completely surrender to that, and therefore feel that their lives are meaningful and fulfilled to a certain degree. So we have that, of course, on a very sort of literal level by the emigration of these old Lutherans, but their practice of religion is quite strict. You know, there's obviously a belief in Christ and the resurrection of Christ, but there is also many other rules which are perhaps not so intrinsic into the practicing, maybe the heart message of Christianity. For instance, they're not permitted to dance, but they can drink alcohol. But there's very strict sort of rules about, for instance, what color wedding dress you can have. Everyone does the same thing all the time, right? You're not allowed to marry outside of your community. And then, so, you know, this is the community that Hannah is raised in, but then also because she has this very intimate relationship with the natural world, she regards it as divine. It speaks to her, it sings to her, and it's something that she can willingly surrender to because she recognizes it as timeless and as all-powerful and as a nurturing force. And she also feels part of it because she can hear it, because she can connect with it. She can almost commune with nature. Yeah. And because she has this level of communion, she's torn, I think, as a young girl, and then later maybe chooses one path over another. Or maybe recognizes that it's not a matter of choice, that things are interconnected, that you can be religious, but also that you can regard nature as a manifestation of a divine power. And so that was something that I was interested in. But also, we've mentioned motherhood, and I was interested in the idea of love and the elevation of that love between a parent and a child. And also there are many chapters which concern the Paramank people, the Indigenous First Nations people of Australia, who have been here for 60,000 years before the British colonization, and their relationship to the land, and the fact that that is sovereign and that is spiritual, deeply, deeply spiritual, and remains so. I wanted to allude to all of these sorts of things and sort of come to the conclusion that they are all equally significant, and that they can coexist and provide meaning to the people who believe in them and have faith in them and practice these deep loves. So these were some of the elements I guess I was exploring, starting out with a very narrow idea of faith and of surrender to that higher power. And then by the end of the novel, opening it out so that it can be myriad and complex, and it can be many. And nature was absolutely a big part of that, I would say. You mentioned earlier the idea of it being devoted to nature, of the natural world having, I guess it's about the things that can exist out of time, that are greater than ourselves, that we can get, deep for soul level fulfillment from. Those things are many, and I guess I wanted to show that there wasn't necessarily just one path to achieving that there are many. Yeah, I'm not sure if that completely answers your question.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I think, as I'm listening to you, all these other layers, I'm sort of aware of the story now through all these other perspectives and layers now that, didn't come to me while I was reading it, but it's beautiful. I think also, Hannah has this quality, like you mentioned earlier, of synesthesia, right? So her ability to sort of feel and hear and, be at one with, all these elements of nature, as though, she's deeply a part of nature. That is also, an element of deep surrender and spirituality. So I was wondering how sort of Hannah's synesthesia contributes to the love story of Hannah and Thea, and whether, why did you choose this element of synesthesia? Was it deliberate and conscious, or did you, I was interested in that.
I think it was a little bit of both. For instance, I can't actually remember the moment where I thought she's going to have synesthesia. In fact, I don't think it came out in such a direct way. I think it was when I was exploring the ways in which this character, my central character, might be different. I knew I wanted to draw nature in because I wanted to write about it. I love writing. I love nature writing. I love trying to distill something which I think is quite elusive and magnificent. And so big and ineffable into prose, that's an exercise and a challenge I really enjoy as a writer. So I knew I wanted to really permeate this novel with the natural world. And it came about, I think, by thinking, okay, this is someone who is expected to exist in a very domestic, very human kind of manner. It's your life is absolutely governed by a lot of man-made institutions and structures. This is a community. You start work when the bell rings, you finish work when the bell rings at the church. Yeah. You basically are completely oriented towards the church and everything that you do, and you're not looking at the wider world. It's very small, it's very parochial. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, one way to make that really difficult for my main character would to have her be constantly looking out towards the greatness that lies beyond, and to be somewhat intoxicated by the deeper mysteries of nature. This is a church which likes to have everything laid out and explained, and that gives many of the congregation members a great deal of satisfaction, but it doesn't satisfy Hannah because she sees and she hears nature speaking to her, and there's so much that she does not know about it, and that's why she finds it so alluring. And yet at the same time, she, like I said earlier, she feels very intimately connected with nature, and she feels like she belongs to it also because the trees speak directly to her. They sing to her. It's not that she's, you know, just a passerby. It feels like absolute engagement. And so this was this, I guess that's how it came about. I thought, how can I make this character different and also write about nature in this book? And I thought, well, let's combine the two. And it wasn't until I think probably the second or third draft that I realized that what she was experiencing was essentially a type of synesthesia. I didn't think of it like that in the earlier form, but it still felt like a very organic connection to make this idea of a narrator who feels like she does not belong in human society to absolutely belong in the natural world and feel very comfortable there.
Yeah, no, it reads very organically, and, you know, it doesn't feel like synesthesia or a condition. It feels like, you know, authentically like Hannah has a spiritual connection with nature. So yeah, it's beautiful. Another thing is, you know, you described so vividly, you know, the landscape of South Australia and how different it is from Prussia, right? So I'll read a little excerpt. You said that in Prussia, canopies were dense and thick. Forest floors were deeply shadowed. Here was a place of lightness. Leaves dappled, thin and shiny, fluttered pink, gray, green. I crushed them in my palm and smelled medicine. Healing, hot. Still days dropped branches and bone crack and brought the sounds of bees. Sometimes I smelled honey warming the air. Animals were muscle, fur, and liquid eyes or scaly thickness, tongues darting. All of it. Trees and possums, kangaroos and bright beads of ants circling trunks, veered from stillness to flashing movement in an instant. There was energy here. So it's just extremely visceral, right, for anybody who hasn't been there. And I think it sort of evokes the sense of wonder because it's so different from Prussia, right? And it occurred to me then that it really must have been like, you know, coming to a new planet, like being on an alien planet, right, for the immigrants who just came there. So I was wondering if, you know, you referred to a lot of research here in terms of the immigrants' experiences, like you did with your previous books, right? Where I gathered that you depended on a lot of research, or was it a lot of your own observations and sense of sort of awe and wonder?
I think it was a mixture of both, to be honest. Certainly there's a section of this book which takes place on the ship over that 6-month journey from Hamburg right through to South Australia. And that was heavily influenced by actual other journeys, the very comparable journeys. I discovered a captain's logbook where he basically wrote about all the various things which happened on this ship journey to the emigrants. And I leaned very hard on that because there was so much rich detail. And I mean, it's something that I could never experience myself. So it was wonderful to have that as kind of an anchoring of all those scenes. When it came to writing about those first impressions of Australia, I think there weren't actually a great many resources that described very specific emotional reactions to the landscape. There were lots of resources which mentioned people, they're very practical things, how they were trying to, you know, grow new plants, how they traveled across the land, how they tried to build villages on you know, indigenous stolen land. And that was useful to a certain extent. But in fact, what I ended up thinking about was when I was in high school, and I had a wonderful art teacher. And as part of studying, you know, artistic representation, Western artistic representation of Australian landscape, I remember he showed us a bunch of paintings which had been painted by people very shortly after the colony was established. And he said, look, does this look like the Australia that you know? Because we lived in this place. And we're thinking, no, it doesn't look anything like it. This looks like Europe, you know. And he said, exactly. They actually could not paint it because they could not see it. They could not see this landscape accurately because they'd never seen anything like it before. It's like trying to imagine a new color. They couldn't. They just had to keep on falling back on the sites and their memories and the ways of painting trees that were familiar to them. And that always really stayed with me because over the course of showing us these very paintings and art history, you see people gradually being able to paint the way that sunlight does fall through gum trees, the way that they don't block out a canopy. And it was a very powerful class, I remember. And so when I came to think about how people, what they might notice as initially as different, those were the sorts of things that came to mind, you know, the idea that sunlight is everywhere here. And then I was also able to think about the things that draw me to this landscape and what I love about it. initially, when I knew that I was going to write a book set in Australia, I was a little bit worried because in my previous novels, I always felt that it was my lack of familiarity with the landscape which enabled me to kind of, see it with really fresh eyes and to have a very strong impression, and then to be able to write from that impression and that sense of wonder and awe. And I was concerned that by writing about a landscape I was raised in, I would actually lack clarity, because it would be too close to home in a way. I would have accepted it too much. I wouldn't be able to regard it anew. And perhaps that's true, but what I did instead was really think back to moments in my life where I have been powerfully moved by the landscape here and the things that I love about it, and then just to write from that deep love of the Australian landscape. And so I think the passages that you read out sort of started out as, okay, what would they notice? What were all the different things that someone unfamiliar to this place would notice? But then what are also the things that I love about it? Because that's, that I think that love will enter that writing and try to, as I said earlier, just distill it onto the page. So yeah, it was a really interesting experience actually writing about a place which I know very well, but one that I found completely fulfilling because it felt very much like a love letter to the landscape here.
So also relatedly, speaking about the Aboriginal community that these immigrants encounter, right? I know that there is a lot of pain and trauma associated with the colonization of Australia by white immigrants, etc. So I was wondering how easy or difficult it was for you to sort of discuss this issue or talk about it without making it an issue. And given the narrative, given the history of pain and trauma, etc., and where did you want to position yourself? I did hear another podcast where we were talking about you didn't want to position yourself from the perspective of the Paramount community, but also not the white invader, right? So try to find that kind of middle ground, that gray area in between.
It was really hard. It's a good question. It was very, very difficult, and I because I am so aware of the devastating effect colonization has on First Nations people here, it was for a long time I didn't want to write a historical novel set in Australia because, like you said and mentioned, I would never take up the perspective of an Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander perspective, because I think as a white person myself, that's an act of cultural appropriation. It's also me taking up space where I don't really deserve to be or need to be. It's another, I don't know, it does not sit well with me on any level. I know that there are some writers who feel that everything's fair game, but I feel quite strongly that those stories and those perspectives need to be shared by First Nations people. So the alternative for me really was to write a historical novel from the perspective of a white settler, a white oppressor. And that didn't necessarily appeal to me at all either, because as is necessary when you're writing historical fiction, your characters to a certain degree need to embody the prejudices and ideologies of that time, in order to write accurate historical fiction, right? And so I thought, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean that the only opportunity really for me to write a historical novel would be from essentially a racist white settler? I don't invader. I don't want to do that. That doesn't interest me. And also, what kind of necessary story is there to tell from that perspective? And I know that those are the two extremes. And so I started thinking, is there another way in which I can show the devastating effects of colonization to the First Nations communities, but also at the same time have a character that I feel comfortable, given my own cultural background, I guess, embodying? Is there a way that I can break clean of those ideologies and those perspectives? So, for instance, it's probably quite difficult to actually talk about because it contains a lot of spoilers. So I will maybe just flag that this is a massive spoiler, but there's a big twist in the middle of the novel. And one of the reasons why that occurs is to enable the main character, Hannah, to break out of her community and to break out of their way of thinking, and actually really to adopt a much more modern mindset and understanding about the impacts of colonization. She's suddenly able to see it in the negative light that it needs to be represented in, and is able to I guess, talk about it within that context, rather than within a context of an inevitability or colonization or, you know, racial prejudice. So that's some of the reasons why I decided to take, I guess, the creative leaps in this book. It was my way of trying to negotiate a space to write about, to write a historical novel set in Australia in. But it was a really tough thing for me to do. I felt deeply uncomfortable about it, and I really wanted to make sure that the story I was telling also was necessary. And I think that's where the queer aspect of it became so important to me, because, you know, where there are so many, I guess, accounts, whether in the historical record or even contemporaneously, that are told, again, it's just, you know, this pioneers narrative, this sort of, you know, thumbs up for colonization narratives. And I have no interest in that, because that doesn't represent my true beliefs. So instead I felt, okay, if I have to adopt, you know, a character who is a white oppressor, a white invader, someone who is stealing sovereign land from an Aboriginal community, can I then make her aware of the devastating consequences? And, you know, looking from a holistic point of view, can I do so in the service of telling a story that is also bringing recognition to a misrepresented or underrepresented aspect of history? And I mean, there is so much invisibility when it comes to LGBTQIA people in the historical records, in the narratives that we receive from the past. So I guess this was my way of, I guess, like I said, negotiating that very difficult path. And also, I guess, my way of thinking about the ethical dilemmas inherent in writing about historical fiction, especially in a place like Australia.
That's really interesting, because, you know, the plot twist that you speak about, I didn't see it in that light at all. I when I read it, but listening to you now, it, you know, it makes a lot of sense, for sure. Another question that I had was about Hannah and Tia and their love story again, and I was wondering whether, you know, you think that you know, their love story flourished in a way also because it was hidden, right? Because it was safe with them, and because it occurred at a time, you know, when queer love was always hidden, whenever it did occur. But at the same time, it also seems like, you know, and you spoke about this elsewhere, that their love is, you know, it's eternal, and, you know, they felt no shame. So do you agree with the fact that you think that their love was safe because it was hidden? Do you agree with that statement? And also, can you speak a little bit about, you know, Han's sort of her growing awareness of her own queerness? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, to answer very, you know, in a short way, I don't think their love was necessarily safe. I think when I knew I was going to write a book about friendship, and then in 2017 in Australia, we had a plebiscite, you know, basically a national vote on whether or not we should permit same-sex marriage. And it was during that time that I thought, I don't want to just write a novel about friendship. I want to write a novel which is a love story between two women, not just their friendship. And because I knew this novel was going to be historical, I knew there would be challenges, and similar to writing about the colonization of Australia, there would be challenges in doing that. And the challenges were there, I thought, not so much because I wanted to write a queer love story, but because I wanted to write a queer love story that wasn't grounded in shame. There are many historical novels which talk about same-sex relationships, and they absolutely have a place, and there are many which I love, but it's very frequently, because of the historical context, shame is a big part of it. It might be shame, it might be these characters being shamed by their communities or by their families. It might be shame of themselves and repression and self-hatred and internalized homophobia, but often these things come about. Similarly, recrimination, punishment, you know, very sad endings. There's a reason why we have the trope, bury your gays, right? I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's this idea that if you have a queer character in a film or TV, that they end up dying. And it's this sort of implicit understanding that that's natural, or that's fated somehow, or that it's punishment for being queer. And I wanted to avoid all of that, because ultimately I thought, when I decided I was going to write a queer love story, I wanted to elevate it. I wanted it to seem timeless and, like you said, internal, and on a certain extent, you know, sublime and divine and pure. I didn't want to sort of couch it in this, you know, sad tragedy of either repression or betrayal or any of these sorts of things. So this was, when I mentioned the twist, this is another reason why there's this twist in the middle of the book, because it allowed me to write my characters in such a way that they were absolutely aware of their feelings for one another, that they were never in a position where they were going to be found out by their religious community, because I'm not only writing a historical love story, it's set in a very pious community. It allowed me to also, I guess, take it outside of time to a certain degree and make it in some ways very contemporary. So these were some of the reasons why people who read the book will perhaps see or understand when they come to that point that things shift, that there's a hinge in the novel. I think that if this book were a little bit more traditional, I don't think it is really a spoiler to say that there are quite a few sort of supernatural or magic realist elements in it. If those things weren't there and it was much more sort of a straightforward narrative of two women falling in love in the past, I think it would be very difficult to write that without some form of cataclysmic loss, whether that is a loss of self or a loss of the loved one or a loss of the relationship. And I had no interest in doing that. So I don't think it would have been safe, because I don't think it ever really is. But I think the way in which it's written and the circumstances of these women's lives means that they can experience it without ever being punished for it. In fact, I think, perhaps ultimately, I like to think of it as not that this book, I think, is very sad in part, but I don't think it's a tragedy. And I think it's for those reasons. It's very hard to talk about this without, giving away so much. But again, these were the things that I was trying to at least juggle in considering how to write a same-sex relationship in a historical context. How could I do it where these characters are aware of their feelings? They're not sort of just ignorantly thinking that they're just really great friends, and not be punished by the outside community, but also feel that this love is worthy of celebration and worthy of, that the other is worthy of ongoing, lifelong devotion.
Right. No, it definitely ends on an extremely epic note. The book, and the message of sort of this eternal elevated love, it does come through, while the characters are extremely real, of course. So unfortunately we've run out of time. Hannah, I've had a fantastic session with you. Thanks so much. I wish we had some more time, but we've run out, unfortunately. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for your questions, Anisha. It was lovely to speak with you.
Likewise.
Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Anisha, for a wonderful conversation. This session was presented by the Australian High Commission. Thank you all for watching. We hope that you'll stay logged on and continue to watch with us the Jaipur Writer Shorts and all the other sessions that have been specially curated for you.